Hi, welcome back to your recap videos for religion and life. Today we're going to be looking at Christianity and abortion, and we'll also be looking at Christianity and euthanasia as well. The main focus of the abortion topic was that we were to evaluate how Christians may view abortion and the issues of morality surrounding it. The first thing I asked you to think about was, what do you imagine a Christian would say about abortion? So understanding our having our knowledge of sanctity of life and our understanding of what Christians feel about life, what do we think Christians might say about them? Now, I think there is a stereotype around that Christians are generally negative about abortion, generally against it, and we'll have a look as to see whether or not that is in fact actually accurate. There's three key words that I want to have a look at: pro-life, pro-choice, and fundamentalist. Now, on the bottom right here, you can see I've got three links I used in the lesson with you. I really would recommend having a look at these. We've got a news article about a pro-life demonstration, and then we've got two adverts, a pro-choice and a pro-life advert, which are, of course, very one-sided in their nature. They're trying to encourage people to be pro-choice or pro-life, but it's really good to watch them because you get a good understanding of the sort of emotional aspect of this debate. The abortion debate, within religion and without, in the secular community, is incredibly emotive. It's something that stirs up people's emotions and people get very, very passionate about. I mean, understandably. And we're going to have a look at some of the religious beliefs that might underpin specifically Christian attitudes towards abortion. Before we go any further, though, I think it's very useful, especially when we're discussing such emotive topics, to have a look at some logical fallacies or some traps that you might fall into. The specific logical fallacy that I want to draw attention to today is something called the slippery slope fallacy, which essentially breaks down to: you said that if we allow A to happen, then Z will eventually happen too. Therefore, A should not happen. So if we let this thing happen, something else will happen, and something else will happen, and something else will happen, and then we'll get to the end result, which is really negative. So an example would be, Colin asserts that if we allow same-sex couples to marry, if we allow that, then the next thing we know, we'll be allowing people to marry their parents. And then the next thing, they'll be allowed to marry their cars. And then eventually we'll get down to the point where people can marry animals or monkeys. Obviously, this is an example of a fallacy, a logical fallacy, because it's problematic reasoning, because it avoids engaging with the actual issue and instead shifts attention to the extreme hypotheticals. No proof is presented to show that these extreme hypotheticals will occur. It's just, well, if we do this, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens. A slippery slope, a thin end of the wedge, often it's sometimes called as well. This fallacy also often appeals to emotion, and it comes in the form of an appeal to emotion fallacy, and it leverages fear, uses the fear of the extreme hypothetical to encourage people to not take the first step, as these people who have fallen victims to this fallacy would suggest. In effect, the argument is unfairly tainted by unsubstantiated conjecture. So conjecture just being, well, a guess essentially, and unsubstantiated, it's not backed up by any evidence. You need to bear in mind that these logical fallacies are incredibly easy to fall into, and you need to be very, very careful. Another one is scarecrows, which we could, straw man fallacy, which we can have a look at a later date. But when you're constructing your arguments for your evaluation questions, and just in general, really, when you're constructing any arguments, you need to make sure that you're trying very carefully to not use faulty reasoning and falling into these fallacious arguments. The reason I brought this to your attention is because I wanted you to bear in mind how this might be applicable to today's lesson. Now, obviously, we're looking at euthanasia and abortion. We'll look at abortion first and euthanasia next. And I'd like you to have a think about how and why I've asked you to think about this. Of course, the reason I've asked you to think about it is because very often one of the main arguments against abortion and euthanasia might be using this slippery slope fallacy. The idea is, well, if we allow abortion of babies at this date, what's next? Will it be any age, any term abortion? Will it be abortions after the babies have been born, and other ludicrous sort of unsubstantiated conjectures and extreme hypotheticals? So you need to be aware of these, okay? It doesn't mean that you can't use these arguments in an evaluation if you are explaining somebody else's point of view. However, you need to be aware that they're not necessarily logically sound. Our three key words today then, we have pro-life, which means opposing abortion. It can also sometimes mean opposing euthanasia. It does tend to be, at least in the media anyway, focused mainly on abortion. However, if you were pro-life, you would also, I would imagine, oppose euthanasia. If you don't know what abortion and euthanasia are, we need to know what these are, so we will get to that. But it's safe to say, if you're pro-life, you oppose abortion, the termination of a pregnancy, and you would oppose euthanasia, the deliberate ending of someone's life, usually because they are suffering or because of medical issues. If you're pro-choice, which is often contrasted with pro-life, you would advocate for the choice of a woman to decide whether or not she will have an abortion. It does not mean that you are for abortions. It doesn't mean that you're pro-abortion. It just means that you are pro the woman having the choice to decide whether or not she does have an abortion. And our third keyword, fundamentalist. Now, fundamentalist is very often used as a pejorative term, but it's not necessarily that. It has come to mean that, especially in the light of terrorism. But fundamentalism really is just a belief in the absolute authority of a sacred religious text or the teachings of a particular religious leader, prophet, and or God. Fundamentalists are often contrasted with liberal Christians, or you might hear them called literalist Christians, or literalists of any religion. You can be a fundamentalist or a literalist in any religion. It just means that you believe in the absolute authority of, say, the Bible or of God, that it is true, that it is absolutely 100% literal and true. It is often used pejoratively as a negative term, but it wouldn't be accurate to say that it is negative to be fundamentalist. It just means that you have a very, very strong belief that your religion is absolutely accurate and that your holy book is absolutely to be taken literally. Not to be interpreted, but to be taken literally. So we've had a look at our keywords. We have ideas of pro-life and pro-choice in our minds, and ideas of sort of fundamentalist attitudes towards scriptural interpretation. What we're going to have a look at now is going to have a look at some attitudes within Christianity towards abortion. So many Christians agree that abortion is wrong. They would say that abortion is wrong, and they believe in the sanctity of life. The sanctity of life, as we covered in our introduction to religion and life, is the idea that life is a gift from God, it's sacred, and it should be preserved and protected. And as a result of this, Christians would say that abortion should not be encouraged, and it's a bad thing because it is the ending of an innocent life, a life which is a gift from God. Now, this could be backed up with sort of the idea that some Christians believe that life begins at conception. Now, conception is the point at which the sperm meets an egg. Now, if you remember back to when we were looking in relationships, we're talking about some Christians believing that every sexual experience, every sexual encounter should be open to the creation of a child, to conception. And they had some very strong ideas about whether or not contraception, artificial contraception should be used. And there was issues around things like the morning after pill, for example, which they would consider to be an early abortion, and it would be killing of the child, or to them they would call it a child, as they believe that life begins at conception. This links in very nicely to "you shall not kill" within the Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments being one of the foundational bases for Christian morality. And if you interpret that entirely literally, you should never kill anybody, and as such, abortion, something that should not be followed. And Roman Catholics as well would believe that for them, every abortion is morally wrong, because they would believe that life begins at conception. They would believe that as soon as that sperm meets the egg, that a life has begun, and that life is sacred and a gift from God. So as a general rule, the majority opinion would be that in Christianity would be that abortion is something that is wrong or something that should not be encouraged. However, as we know, as I constantly keep saying, Christianity and all religions are not monoliths, and as such there are some other contrasting Christian perspectives. So other Christians might believe that the church stands for justice, and if abortions were banned, then rich women could simply pay to go to other countries for abortions, and poor women couldn't, and this would be unjust, and it would just help to reproduce the sort of social inequality between rich and poor, which obviously Christians should be trying to alleviate. Also, Jesus told people to love their neighbour, and sometimes an abortion may be the most loving option. And this is often phrased as abortion being the lesser of two evils. Now, for example, if there might be a situation where a woman is going to be caused serious health issues by continuing a pregnancy, or maybe if the child is a product of a rape or some other sort of sexual assaults, some Christians would say that the most loving option would be to allow that woman to have an abortion, and it would be measured as the lesser of two evils. They would say, yes, abortion is bad, however, in this specific circumstance, it's acceptable given the suffering that will be caused by continuing the pregnancy. So there are a balance of views within the Christian perspective. There are those who say, no, absolutely never. Sanctity of life, super important. We should never kill. We should never waste the gift of life. And there are others who might say, well, actually, on balance, there might be more important things at stake. So the welfare of the mother or the welfare of the child, in fact, maybe. Of course, we also have some denominational differences, as you would expect. Catholics, obviously, life is holy and belongs to God. It's a sacred gift from God. They would believe in the idea of thou shalt not kill. Every person has the right to life, and they believe specifically that life begins at conception. And the Catholic Church teaches that state abortion is murder. Now, obviously, please bear in mind, not all Catholics would be so stark in their beliefs. As always, I'm just teaching you the broad strokes of the doctrines, but this is broadly what Catholics would tend to believe. Protestants, on the other hand, they might be less likely to believe that life begins at conception. They would focus more on the justice of the church, that Jesus told people to love their neighbour, and they would also perhaps mention that sanctity of life, yes, life is sacred and a gift, but we do break the idea of sanctity of life with things such as just war. There are circumstances which some Christians would say there are wars that are justified, and there are circumstances where it's justified for a Christian to end a life, or for the state to end someone else's life. And also, Protestants might be more open to accepting medical advances. Now, if an abortion is going to be a medical procedure, which is going to perhaps save the woman's life, or indeed if the risk of continuing the pregnancy is so high, some Protestant Christians might be more accepting of an abortion for medical reasons. So it's really important to remember there's a diversity of opinion within Christianity, and also there's a diversity within the denominations themselves. So as always, you need to make sure you're using your words like some, many, most, and try and avoid using terms like all Christians believe this, all Christians believe that. Whilst not being accurate, you also paint yourself into a corner sometimes when being asked to evaluate, because then you need to bring in a separate religion. If you say all Christians believe this, and then your second argument is that other Christians believe this, it's a nonsensical argument. And we don't want to be creating nonsensical arguments. So the lesser of two evils then, we've used this term, but what do we actually mean by it then? So really it's suggesting that there's two bad choices. Neither one is good, but you pick the one that is the least bad. It's pretty self-explanatory really. So an example would be if a mother's life was in danger if she continued with her pregnancy. Whilst it is bad to to kill the fetus, if by doing that you save the mother's life, then that would be perhaps deemed as the lesser of the two evils. So this means that neither one is good, but Christians may, or other religious people may, choose the one that will cause the least harm. Now, obviously, they need to do a value judgment about what causes harm in this context. And this isn't just restricted to religious people. Non-religious groups may also have attitudes towards abortion that obviously wouldn't encourage it necessarily. They might support a woman's right to choose, but they're not necessarily pro-abortion. And if you are interested in looking at the humanist perspective on abortion, the British Humanist Association does provide a sort of non-religious perspective on abortion, and I'll link that in the description below. So if you're interested in looking at the humanist perspective, I'd recommend looking there. So look down in the description for that link. As we had in a previous video, I've now got an example of a 12-mark question that you might be asked to write, or an example of something similar you might write. So the statement being abortion is murder. Evaluate this statement. So you need to refer to Christian teachings, you need to give developed arguments to support the statement, you need to give developed arguments to support a different point of view, and you need to reach a justified conclusion. Now, you need to make sure that you're explicitly referring to a Christian teaching and also or a religious teaching, and specifically saying which religion. It's not good enough to say religious people. You need to be very, very specific. I'll leave this up for a couple of seconds in case those of you who may want to write it down. I would recommend having a go at it, even if you have already done it before. At some point later, I will eventually get around to creating a 12-mark structure video, which goes through exactly what is needed to be done here. But if you need any advice on this, obviously you can ask me in person, you can ask in the comments below, or you can look on the AQA website. Having looked at abortion and Christian attitudes towards that, we're now going to look at euthanasia, very similar but slightly different topic, and we're going to be looking at Christian views towards euthanasia. Sanctity of life obviously was our starter task here. I'm going to repeat it because it bears repeating and it's very important. Sanctity of life is the belief that life is a gift from God, it's a sacred thing, and therefore it should be protected and preserved, which might lead you to be able to have a guess at our challenge task, which asks you to think about what do you think Christian perspectives on euthanasia might be. The three key words for today: euthanasia, sanctity of life, and dignity. So our three key words today, we have euthanasia. Now, euthanasia means steps taken to end someone's life to stop their suffering. So euthanasia is the premature ending of somebody's life. It usually is for medical or welfare reasons. Sanctity of life, of course, the idea that human life is sacred, holy, and precious, and therefore should be protected, and is a gift from God. And of course, dignity. Now, dignity, if someone has dignity, it means they are worthy of respect. Very often, people who promote the euthanasia say that people should be allowed to die with dignity, should be allowed to, rather than spend the last years of their life in suffering and humiliation, they should be able to end their life with dignity. It's important that we understand these three key words and that we can use them appropriately in the answers to our questions. So then, what do Christians say about euthanasia? As a general rule, euthanasia is wrong, according to most Christians, for various reasons. One, they would say that life is a gift from God and should be respected, sanctity of life. God created life, so only God can end life. And three, that God will support you through your suffering. Suffering is a very interesting thing within Christianity. There are some Christians who would say that suffering is a positive thing in life, because it is a test, or could be seen as a test from God, a test of our faith and test of our goodness, but also it could be seen to be emulating Jesus' suffering on the cross. Jesus suffered on the cross, so if Christians suffer in the world, it is as if they are sharing in that suffering with Jesus and becoming closer to God. So quotes to support this point of view then from Christians, we've got obviously do not commit murder, and if you consider the ending of someone's life to be murder, then you wouldn't do it. John Paul II said that euthanasia is a grave violation of the law of God. So that would be specifically influential for Catholics, being a pope, but other Christians may draw inspiration from that. And from the Corinthians, we've got here quite a wordy one. Surely you know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit lives in you. So if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and you yourselves are his temple. Now, this can be used as an argument or a justification against suicide, a justification as an argument against euthanasia, or against assisted suicide, which is essentially euthanasia. So, as a general rule, Christians would say euthanasia is wrong for these reasons. However, as would be expected, there are of course denominational differences on the view on euthanasia. Like abortion, the view is not the same across all denominations. Firstly, looking at the Catholic Church specifically, Catholic Church teaches that euthanasia is a grave violation of the law of God. They are very negative towards euthanasia in general. However, of course there's a however, it's never that simple. However, if large doses of painkillers are used to help a person suffering, and then as a result of that the person dies, this is okay. Now this is a doctrine which is called the doctrine of double effect. It's quite a complicated one, but it's important that you know it, because if you can reference it, you can give really nuanced arguments and demonstrate your knowledge of the sort of subtlety of the Christian ideas about euthanasia. So the doctrine of double effect states that if doing something morally good has a bad side effect, then it's ethically okay to do that thing, even assuming as long as you weren't intending the bad side effect. This is true even if you knew that the bad side effect would probably happen. Okay, now that's quite a lot, it's quite wordy. So an example of this would be the trolley problem, which we may or may not have looked at, or you may or may not be aware of. There's quite a lot of links in this video, so I will link a video explaining the trolley problem in this one as well. But the idea would be that if you pull there's a train coming towards 5 people tied on a train track. If you pull the lever to turn the train onto another track, which kills the one person, thus saving the 5 people, that would be okay under the doctrine of double effect, because you are doing something morally good by saving 5 people, and even though you knew that the bad side effect would happen, it's okay. It would be justifiable under this doctrine. So some Catholics might use this to justify euthanasia in situations where there is extreme suffering, if somebody is suffering immensely. So moving on to look at the Anglican Church then, the Church of England teaches that although the deliberate taking of a human life is forbidden, there are strong arguments for people not being kept alive at all costs when they are suffering intolerable pain. So if you are in an absolutely horrendously painful situation full of suffering, Anglican Christians would say then in that case, yes, it would be acceptable to end that person's suffering. In fact, it would be the good thing to do. So if we look at the differences, but there are some similarities then. So both Protestants and Catholics tended to approve of passive euthanasia, but they highly disapproved of active euthanasia. Now the difference between these is quite important for you to understand. So there are 2 different forms of euthanasia. So active euthanasia is when active steps are taken to end someone's life. For example, if you gave them a lethal injection, so deliberately, like actively ending that person's life, whereas passive euthanasia would be, for example, when doctors stop providing treatment or do something that is intended to quicken the natural process of dying. An example of this would be not resuscitating a person after a heart attack. Okay, so Protestants and Catholics tended to approve of passive euthanasia, but they were highly negative towards active euthanasia. It is important to know that all forms of euthanasia are currently illegal in the UK and would be considered murder or manslaughter. However, a medical decision may be made to withhold treatment if there is a best interest decision made. it's a very, very tricky area, both religiously and within contemporary British society, this. But in general, when we're looking at religions, conservative Protestants were more opposed to passive euthanasia on most dimensions than were Catholics. So lots of differences here. As long as you understand the difference between active and passive euthanasia, and there is diversity of opinion within the religious communities about these things, and you can explain that diversity of opinions, you're good to go. So many Christians then believe that the taking of life is directly interfering with God's plan, and they would say this is comparable to murder and could be open to abuse. For example, they might argue that if euthanasia was legalised, it could potentially lead to people who were simply depressed, or I say simply depressed, depression is an awful thing, but people who were depressed or just not having a good time, or were very old, it might lead them to feeling pressured to ask for euthanasia so that they don't burden their families. You could use that as an example of a slippery slope fallacy, because it avoids the issue and jumps to extreme hypotheticals. However, most Christians believe that euthanasia is against the sanctity of life, and only God has the right to take life away at a chosen time. On the screen, you should be able to see, well, you can see, I know you can see it, the Hospice movement, information about the Hospice movement. This was founded by a Christian doctor, and it's a place where terminally ill people can live out the remainder of their life and be looked after in comfort and with dignity. Parents can go to hospice for short-term breaks as well as long-term care. They offer palliative care, which is treatment of symptoms of an illness, not the illness itself. And also counselling is available for family and relatives. Many Christians would say that the hospice movement and modern drugs which can be used for palliative care mean that euthanasia is not necessary, because there are ways to provide people who are dying with comfort and with dignity. So going a little bit off-piste and bringing some comparative religion into the question, what about Islam, and what about their views on euthanasia? Now, this is going to be incredibly brief and not as in-depth as I would normally do a whole video on, just a little bit of comparison in case you need a different religious perspective to bring in. So in general, Muslims are against euthanasia because the Quran says that suicide is wrong, and here we have an extract: don't throw yourselves with your own hands into destruction. Euthanasia is murder, which is banned in the Quran, and only Allah has the right to take away life, and therefore euthanasia will be seen as disobeying Allah. And Muslims believe that life is a test, and ending it early would be essentially like cheating in said test. So very similar beliefs to Christianity, although of course framed slightly differently and with slightly different scriptural source. Of course, it wouldn't be a religious perspective without there being a however. Some Muslims do agree with the previous points that were mentioned, but they feel that switching off life support machines is not euthanasia. So they would say passive euthanasia, for example, might not actually count as euthanasia. They would argue this because some Muslim lawyers have agreed that machines can be switched off if doctors believe life has ended, and if a person is brain dead, then Allah has already taken their life, and therefore it cannot be classed as euthanasia. So there is some nuance within Islam, of course, as there are in all religions. Very similar to Christianity, there is a diversity of belief around euthanasia. Well, hopefully that's given you a little bit of a recap on the Christian attitudes towards abortion and the Christian and a little bit of Islam attitudes towards euthanasia. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me in the comments below, or if you have any comments that you wish to add. Recently, a couple of people have been commenting on the videos. It's good to see some engagement. I'm very happy to reply, and I will do my best to reply to all comments. Like I said, if you have any questions, put them in the comments below, send me an email directly, or if you're one of my students, pop in and see me.